Good morning, Property and Poppadoms. Hello, Propenomix people, and welcome to another video. This one is about primarily the spending review, but also, as so often with the supplements, the current market, what's going on, and all of that around the UK property market and the macroeconomy. So for those who haven't listened before, I like to start with a quote. And this week's quote is, "Use a picture, it's worth 1,000 words." That was first attributed to Arthur Brisbane, the newspaper editor, back in the early 1900s. So the quote pertains directly to the deep dive and the diagram that I've shared this week, which you can find on the Property and Poppadoms website. You can also find on the Partners in Property website, or you can find on my LinkedIn, Adam Lawrence. I've shared it. It's about the impact of the 2024 autumn budget and some of the things that therefore we're dealing with on the back of it. If you haven't seen the diagram, what it essentially says is everyone apart from the top 10% of households are better off, which I'm sure feels great to the Labour Party ideology. The issue being the top 10% of households, if it was looked at as income tax, they pay 60% of the income tax. So the 10% of people who already pay 60% of the tax are going to be worse off over the course of the whole of this parliament. And Labour decided that was a good idea. Now, of course, the problem is some of those are mobile and decide to take their capital elsewhere, especially when you interject ridiculous ideological things such as VAT on private schools, or also you interject things like inheritance tax on their worldwide assets, which mobile people do not have to deal with. People born outside of the UK are vastly overrepresented in the top 10% of earners, and more importantly, in the top 0.1% of earners, vastly overrepresented. And it's as simple as, if you've already moved in the past, moved your whole domicile, moved your country, moved your family, moved whatever, you're probably more likely to be able to move again quite easily to a regime that is much less ridiculous about trying to tax you on your worldwide assets when you pass away. Imagine being a billionaire and voting for that. It's not going to happen, is it? Ultimately, it's just not going to be something you're not going to love the UK enough, most likely in 90% of cases, to stay, regardless of what happens to your wealth when you pass away, the wealth that you've worked so hard for. So there we go. But that's why I wanted to share that diagram. Now, before I go in full throttle, Rod and I are running another workshop, property business workshop, in July, Thursday the 3rd. It's creeping up on us, just over a couple of weeks away. Joint ventures and mergers and acquisitions this time around. It's always a popular one. A whistle-stop tour of the agenda. We're going to talk about market dynamics, JV opportunities, and optimal legal structuring for property businesses. Learn the pros and cons of limited companies, share classes, shareholder agreements, and sustainable JV models. Dive into capital structuring, comparing debt versus equity, managing risk, and understanding personal guarantees. Gain insight into property M&A from due diligence all the way through to asset versus share purchases. Apply concepts through 2 in-depth case studies, acquiring an asset-backed property company and navigating a distressed business sale. Understand strategic disposals, company wind-ups, and how to negotiate under pressure while maximising value. Now, we're still at early bird ticket stage, just about a 10% discount. There's less than a week or so to go on the early bird, so don't miss that discount. bit.ly/PBW7. There's also a link in the show notes. Now, my new segment of the supplement is called Trump Watch, and surprisingly enough, there's stuff to watch every week. So what did he get up to last week? Well, he got busy with the National Guard and the Marines in California. There was a legal battle around all this, and then it was overruled, and then the overrule was overruled. Executive orders were also signed to repeal the gas-powered, or petrol or diesel cars, as we call them, or ICE cars, as we also call them these days. They're banned in California from 2035 in terms of the sale of them. But an executive order was signed to get rid of that, basically overruling what is the single most democratic stronghold of all, California, and trying to overrule the governor there at the federal level. More legal action triggered on the back of that. Probably the most litigious, probably the sector that's benefited the very most from President Trump's election. Again, the legal sector. Then there was a disclosure of $600 million of income, including $57 million from crypto token sales for the president. So I think the most charitable thing you could say about that is blending business and politics together. In many other regimes, that would obviously be being called out for what it is, which is essentially corruption. Tariff-wise, the appeal for the reversal of the fentanyl and reciprocal tariffs, so I think China, Mexico, is set to be heard on July the 31st, which keeps those tariffs in place for the moment. July the 9th is the D-Day for the delayed tariffs. You might remember there was a 90-day delay put on when there was all that flux and essentially market panic we were getting towards in early April, by which point trade negotiations were supposed to be concluded. But of course, if there's another delay, another 30 days, another 45 days, it wouldn't look unreasonable. Much of the commentary is suggesting extra time is needed because only some fairly small, fairly fiddly deals have been signed so far. Mr. Trump also seized the nettle and offered a second chance to Iran for a nuclear agreement based on the events in the Middle East in the past week. And let's not forget, he's also on his 80th journey around the sun. And it's hard to forget that after his strongman military celebration of his 79th birthday on the 14th. Oh, well, it only cost the American taxpayer a few tens of millions, so efficient, would we call that? I don't know. Let's anyway get to the UK real-time property market. Chris Watkin delivers week 22 in the can and back to normal weeks after the shortened bank holiday week report from the week before. Listings back to 39,300, still 6% higher than 2024 and 8% higher than the pre-pandemic market. I'm sticking with my ready reckoner of 10% more stock than a normal market. Nearly 28,000 price reductions, 27,900, 14% reduced in the month of May. That compared to 12.1 for 2024 and the 5-year average of 10.6. So we've got more stock and more reductions, about 1 in 7 being reduced, right? 32% more reductions than the 5-year average if you take the difference between 14% and 10.6%, which is the average. So 25% more reduced properties than a normal market works as a ready reckoner. 1 in 7 being reduced. So remember, there's more properties in the first place as well. So an extra 100,000 or 200,000 properties, that's an extra at 14%, an extra 14,000 reductions per month over and above what you would normally expect, or in the course of a year anyway. 28,600 homes sold subject to contract. So I think you can still call the market pretty healthy. Sold subject to contracts up 8% year on year, 16% up on the pre-pandemic market. Still nearly keeping pace with 2022, which up until this point, so the June 22, was still a very hot market, if you recall. We went into June with 756,675 homes on the market. As the market got stickier before the pandemic, that number was about 660,000 at this time of year. So a seller's market is more likely to be under sort of 600,000 pieces of stock on the market. So at the end of May last year, 694,000 were on the market. So it's a lumpy trend upwards in only May, really. With this amount of stock coming on the market, it's going to be continually hard for prices to surge forward in the coming months. That flat feeling will likely manifest in a steady market without much excitement as we head into summer proper. The first month which sees fewer on the market that isn't November or December would be a tell that this glut of stock, which must be provided, in my opinion, at least in part by exiting landlords, the never spoken about truth of this current market, has reached its peak. But there's no surefire sign we're at the peak yet by any means. So a net increase in stock of over 40,000 homes on the market in May. May 2018 was similar. The normal number looks more like 10 to 15,000 more on a typical year. I'm not reading too much into that just yet. 1 month, who knows? Stamp duty holiday, or stamp duty changes at the end of March. We can't read anything too much into that so far, but it is informing some of the headlines you will have read about flat markets, about Rightmove indices dropping and other people printing a fall in the market and all the rest of it. We'll see more in the RICS report. So, like I say, don't read anything into one single month. Rarely do I ever advocate doing that unless there's been a real black swan style shock. Now, if buyers don't match sellers, what has to give? The important figures are demand is up year on year, but supply is up more. That's essentially what's happening. So am I calling a drop in pricing? Well, no, I'm just calling not much of an increase, not keeping up with the increases still in wages and inflation, which are going forward quite a bit. I'm expecting flat output from Halifax and Nationwide's indices over the coming few months. Fall throughs are staying below the 7-year average at 23.5%. Last week was 21.7, so relatively normal noise. Net sales are playing ball, 6% up on last year, 11.2% higher than 17 to 19. Not quite 2022 levels, but the stamp cliff will have forced a few more transactions out of bed, of course. And as the year progresses, then in the absence of any more shocks, things will likely catch up because transactions were significantly disturbed by the 2022 budget and the bond markets, of course, in comparison. I always give Chris this weekly shout out because he's more prolific than only this epic tome that he releases weekly on the UK property market. Comes up with great stats on a regular basis. I'm grateful for him for the conversations he engages in with me and the stuff he sends over to me as well. If you're in the industry and you want to support in growing your business or in being a more effective communicator in general, being more in touch with your local market, that's his core business. So give him a shout. You can contact him on LinkedIn, via his YouTube channel at Christopher Watkin, and he also publishes on the Property Industry Eye website where you can leave a comment, and I'm sure you can attract his attention in one or more of those ways. Okay, let's catch the macro waves then. We had a chunky week. The easing labour market report, growth for awful April figures were out, and then the RICS house price balance has to be in, especially after that chat about flattening markets. And after that, of course, I concentrate on gilts and swaps, as will remain a mainstay in the supplement for many coming months and years, no doubt. So reporting on and forecasting April 25 was both easy and difficult. No one credible suggested it would be anything other than a bad month as minimum wage rises kicked in, alongside massive cost increases in national insurance for businesses. Anything remotely people-heavy suffered. Payroll employees were down 55,000 in April and down 115,000 on the year. Now, let's remember when we look at this stat that many companies have a much bigger incentive now to move people off payroll and look at self-employed options, especially small companies that aren't necessarily caught by IR35, right? And many employees might be forced into those spots, those self-employed spots, even if they don't want them, because they've lost a job. And therefore, a new job is a self-employed style role rather than that security of full-time payroll. So you do need to read that stat with a dose of skeptical salt, because it won't just be about payroll employees. But the early May estimates are equal carnage. There are often big revisions on the early estimates, but we can't ignore the early estimate of 109,000 fewer payroll employees for May. If that played out, it would be huge. Or if that has played out, because it's already happened, May, of course, and it gets reported on, that would be massive. Let's see, because like I say, there are usually big revisions in this figure. But on that basis, you bet on the unemployment figure, which is now 4.6, moving to 4.7 next month. Now, they even put an extra special cautionary note in this month in the ONS because of the timing of the data extract, apparently. Perhaps something to do with the end of May bank holiday. Not really sure. So let's wait for next month before we worry too much about any of that. My prediction for the year for unemployment by the end of the year is that we get up to about 4.8. I still feel that's roughly about where we'll be. The most important stat line, though, in the whole report is the big picture one, which is 75.1 employed, 4.6 unemployed, 21.3 inactive. Now, you'll notice that doesn't add up to 100. I'll talk a bit more about that later, because not only does it not add up to 100, it's nowhere near 100% really when you add all those together. It could be worse, but there are worse figures. So 21.3 is down significantly in the past quarter and year, down 0.2 in the past quarter, down a full % on the year. But we're still another full % ahead of where this rate was before the pandemic. And the economy needs to get back there and better. It's the most important figure of all. Arguably, better to be unemployed than inactive, certainly when we're at levels of under 6% or so of unemployment. At higher rates of unemployment, there are likely larger issues to solve in the economy, larger structural issues, but we're nowhere near that sort of number, happily. It could be you're in training, which would be preferable, but the majority of the inactivity is better seeking work than not seeking work as the numbers shake down. And of course, you might be in training and still seeking work. That's perfectly possible. So the terrible headlines were not that terrible. Or as I often say, the fact we started with such a low base gave room for these Labour policies increasing the cost of workers by such a large amount. It's not the same as the economic backfire argument, which I'll explore in the growth section. Unemployment in isolation and having a smaller but more productive workforce is not the worst thing in the world at the macro level. It's just not great if you've lost your job and that job isn't being replaced, or is being outsourced abroad, or has been AI'd out, or whatever you want to call it. Vacancies fell for the 35th rolling quarter on the spin, so that's a 35-month period, but they look at the last 3 months to smooth out too much noise when it comes to vacancies. The fall was nothing short of huge. 63,000 vacancies culled, 8% off the top. There are now 59,000 fewer job vacancies than in January 2020. There are recruitment freezes, and there's an unwillingness to replace people who are leaving jobs. For context, the UK working age population in January 2020 was about 42 million. In quarter 1 2025, it was about 43.2 million, so up about 3% over that time period. More people chasing fewer vacancies. So by comparison between that and Jan 2020, which many people might not remember with a lot of clarity because 2020 is remembered obviously for the pandemic, but that would suggest more of an employer's market by comparison. And I think we'll expect that to play out over the coming months and years as it stands. Unemployment matched economists' expectations for the month. Average earnings came in a little below, about 0.2% below expectations, but we're still talking about low fives, 5.2 without bonus, 5.3 including bonus. So about 5.25 is a fair proxy. And that also breaks back as 5.6% in the public sector and 5.1 in the private sector, although there was an imbalance the other way during the pandemic, of course. So this breakdown was not in the ONS reports, even if you go back a year, unfortunately. It's a new addition, which is good. Adjusted for CPIH, which is the ONS's preferred measure of inflation including housing costs, basically, this makes a real terms pay rise of 1.4 to 1.5%. And reasonable is the word I would use about that. Public sector employment is up 35,000 in the past year, and there were 47,000 working days lost to labour disputes in April 2025. In April 24, this number was down to 17,000, but there were many more months with this figure above the 100,000 mark and higher, as there were many post-pandemic pay disputes, which you will remember. So another way of looking at the figures would be to say that lower inactivity is driving unemployment. So since 1 year ago, 1% have become economically active, and that sees unemployment up 0.2, unemployment up 0.8. So that 80-20 split would be most welcomed if we took another 1% back from inactivity to activity, and that would take us back to the pre-pandemic level of inactivity, which would be a big day, down towards the sort of 20% level, which would be great and should be our target. The UK has been very, very slow on this when compared to other Western nations. Right, the rest of the G7 were back where they were before, either in 2021 or 2022. Now, I need to explain something here because I've heard some quite well-known and high-profile economists tell half of this story, really. So that's half of the story, comparing us to where we were before the pandemic. The other half is, how do we compare overall when we look at employment versus unemployment versus inactivity, right? And actually, we compare fairly favorably to a lot of the rest of the world with our participation rate, or whatever you want to call it. They measure it differently in the US. The Netherlands are the world model for fantastic participation, and their employment rate is somewhere in the 80s. I think it's about 82 or 83. So they do very well. But countries like France, for example, have got much lower participation rates. So overall, we're not doing too bad, but we're not doing as well as we were 5 years ago. So that's the proper data-driven conclusion to draw from the figures. Anything else becomes a bit too political for me. But if the G7 got back to where they were in 21 or 22, that suggests a specific policy problem, which I believe was identified but largely ignored by the Tories. And this has been identified and tweaked by Labour rather than fixed, their efforts to change PIP and sickness benefits and things like that. But to be 3 or more years away and then to need at least another year is incredibly expensive and damaging to the economy. We need to get on with this and get back to where we were, and not worry too much about where we sit in the global tables, although we should also strive to be better. If the Netherlands can hit 82, 83%, why can't we? Especially as there's quite a lot of similarity between the two countries. So the ratio before the pandemic, 76.6 employed, 3.9 unemployed, 20.2 inactive, right? The reason why it doesn't add up to 100 is because the employed are counted at whatever age they're employed, even though the working age population stops at 65. So don't get me started on all that. It's a bit of a joke, to be honest with you. But If we work back from inactive plus unemployed at that point, we get back to 24.1 unemployed or inactive. And then I would say 75.9 employed, because we're shoehorning it back into those between 16 and 64, right? Now, today we'd have 4.6 unemployed, we know that, 21.3 inactive, and therefore we row back to 74.1 employed and 25.9 unemployed or inactive. So that's nearly 2%, it's 1.8% difference. So it's a huge difference since before the pandemic, and that needs sorting out. So I've just effectively statistically normalized the ONS official employed figure, because it goes beyond the age brackets, and just done 100 minus unemployed plus inactive. I hope that makes some sense. I think it's probably a better yardstick than the way they do the figures, if I'm honest with you, but there we go. So politics to one side, both the Tories and Labour have been poor. No wonder the person on the street isn't feeling any benefit from pre-pandemic. The time it's taken to get back to par is frankly ridiculous. And unemployment and inactivity won't be back down below this 25% level during this administration, I don't personally think, primarily because of massive increased costs. And with further labour market regulations set to come, it's further going to put employers off people's side of things and put them towards outsourcing, offshoring effectively, further automation, use of AI. As I say, probably the big three threats to employed jobs at the moment, one of them being relatively new over the recent years. It would take a real benefit squeeze to push us back to where we were after the state has expanded so much during the pandemic, and that expansion is set to continue in real terms at 1.2% per year on day-to-day spending. But anyway, more on that in the deep dive. So hope for better figures for May's figures when they come out, but the expectation will be the same or worse based on the predictions. We know May was milder from the PMIs, but companies in there are still reporting shedding jobs. So the difference between 4.6 and 4.7 next month will be rounding, I'd suggest. Okay, on to growth then. Okay, that's the end of that section. No, I'm only kidding, of course. The worst month since the pandemic is in the can and confirmed, with awful April returning minus 0.3% GDP growth. I had pointed out some time ago that NISA's forecast for April being a positive month was basically crackers, and it's so it played out. Models don't capture step changes like the national insurance increase because they have no real precedent to work from, and because they weight near-term data far too strongly. We also had the tariff shock to deal with, which damaged exports, and indeed many exports have been front-loaded into Q1, which probably inflated our figures to get to that 0.7 when the underlying economy is doing nothing like 0.7 in Q1 of 2025. And of course, at some point, we've effectively borrowed from the future there. We'll pay for that in future growth figures. But we managed to absorb this minus 0.3 for April because we had a good couple of months before. So the rolling 3-month figure is still 0.7, which is way above expectations, mostly because of the February anomaly. Now, as usual with the ONS, I can't get this to add up because we had 0.5% on in Feb, 0.2 on in March, and then lost 0.3 in April, and somehow that's still plus 0.7. I don't know how, but there we go. We might have to start calling him the ON mess until someone steps up to the plate to sort that organisation out, frankly. Likewise, January drops out, 0% growth. April minus 0.3 drops in, but the rolling figure stays at 0.7, which is where it was for Q1. Go figure, if you'll pardon my pun. Services contracted 0.4 on the month, the same 0.4 they increased by in March. Production was down 0.6, construction was up 0.9. So what did badly in April? Perhaps it's not exactly what you'd expect, actually. Professional, scientific and technical activities, primarily in services, alongside information and communication, mostly driven, according to the ONS, by the front-loading of property transactions in March, thanks to the stamp duty deadline and its impact on the legal profession. So there you go. Stamp duty had far-reaching consequences. Who knew? The drivers forward in construction were new infrastructure work alongside private housing repair and maintenance. So more repair, less new is the current story, keeps being borne out in the figures. The ONS puts the blame on stamp duty and tariffs, mentioning the national insurance increases just in passing at the end. We've got to make our own minds up on that truth, it would seem. But of course, this shock isn't all going to be loaded into April by any means. Companies that were prepared may well have laid employees off and changed things around before April. Companies who had a bit of a shock in April, smaller companies who might not have budgeted effectively or understood all the full impacts of the budget, are likely to act in May, June, July rather than having acted in April. So there is an element of logic in that, I suppose. So maybe if you put March and April together to make up for the stamp duty, because we had an increase and then a decrease in the legal services sector, and exports should improve when we see the May figures, because they would have been problematic in April. There's a lot of frozen stuff, and a lot of stuff then would have been kicked into May, although we don't know how much was front loaded into Q1. Obviously, it depends on what you're exporting, what the shelf life of it is, and all the rest of it, aside from anything else. So, yeah, speculative exports or imports from into the US, more likely in Q1, obviously impacted our figures. But we follow the logic through. Since the housing market largely looked to be repaired, as far as we saw from April and May figures that we've seen, no major dramatic shifts in everything, although the HMRC transaction figures for May aren't out until the 27th. So as usual, it's not as easy as it looks, but the 0.7 growth figure doesn't look real or reflective to me. I expect it will play out in dragging the rest of this year's growth figure downwards, not negative, but flat. The economic backfire argument I referred to is quite simple. By raising national insurance quite so much, the 25 billion raised, 5 billion was from the public pot anyway, the public sector cost. Another 4 billion came off corporation tax revenue. That's a 16 billion net raised, is equivalent to about 1.7% of economic growth. So there's an argument that since the announcement of the budget, economic growth is 1.7% lower than expected. Now, current revisions downwards since the budget are about 1 to 1.25%, depending on which figures that you follow. And there were revised forecasts, of course. Then the entire project has raised nothing at all and has just increased unemployment. This is actually fairly typical in an advanced system. There's no free lunch, and every tax change is actually a trade-off. The real raise, therefore, is in the low billions if you draw a direct comparison between the NI announcement and the lack of growth. And some of that will play out over a couple of years just because of discouraged investment as well, which is very hard to monitor because we only know what happens, not what would have happened if something hadn't changed, if that makes sense. But yeah, like I say, it's trade-offs. That's economics for you as a general rule, right? It's a trade-off of resources. So there's also even more that we're not in control of here as well. Bear in mind, tariffs, Mr. Trump driving investment money out of the United States, potentially into the UK. The flight from the dollar is fairly unprecedented stuff. Still plenty of time for that to play out after all. And it might just be the case of not being able to take as much advantage of that as we would have liked. You could just reframe it as it's better to be lucky than good, which definitely applies in government. The first form of luck is not getting bad luck. No real economic crises to deal with, for example. So to finish off on growth and the lack thereof, NISA, the National Institute of Economic and Social Research, who have pretty good forecasts in normal times as a general rule, they see Q2 growth at 0.3. Bear in mind, we're kicking off with minus 0.3. That sounds super hopeful to me. This would see, although the logic doesn't work, their May forecast at about 0.2%. So in spite of falling way short on April's forecast, they've only revised this downwards from 0.4 to 0.3. Now, I think 0 to 0.1 would be more realistic, and minus 0.1 is perfectly possible for Q2. Let's face it. PMIs have recovered, but only to flat levels, although this doesn't necessarily play out straight away. We've got a couple of weeks left now of Q2, that's all, but don't have any major UK-specific economic crises to deal with at this time in the next fortnight. Depends what happens to the oil price, of course. That has a relatively quick impact, certainly on pockets at the petrol pumps. But just as a postscript to the growth here, I actually looked at the end of the last stamp duty holiday. So you might remember the 2020 holiday announced, scheduled to end in March 21. There was a really quite late stay of execution, risky on the 23rd of March 2021, actually announced they were going to extend until June 21 or the end of June. So that helped a bit with bottlenecks and things and lots of transactions not falling apart. But indeed, in July 2021, by far the largest negative contraction was in exactly the same sector to exactly the same amount. So professional, scientific and technical activities, because it captures the legal sector, right? So the ONS report for July 2021 actually said the drop in legal activities and real estate activities on a fee or contract basis, which fell by 10.4%, reflects the partial end to the stamp duty holiday period in England and Northern Ireland. So the piece of reasoning that the ONS have used does stack up. The contribution to GDP from just this sector alone was exactly the same in the 2 months being compared here by me, July 21 and April 25, minus 0.2% to the whole of the economy Huge numbers, 6 billion, thick end of 6 billion quid, right? Still got to explain another 0.1 just to get back to zero. The other two sectors that contributed about minus 0.1 to GDP was the repair of motor vehicles and motorcycles. And perhaps that's just because in April the new registrations are out, so repair goes down, new goes up. And information and communication, which cited a drop in programming, consultancy, and a big drop in the motion picture, TV, sound and music industry. Is that best explained by investment being rocked by the wage and national insurance changes? I don't know enough about those sectors to be able to say that with any certainty. So let's go on to the RICS residential market survey. Straight to the balance number, because that's the big one that hits the headlines. -8 for May from -3 in April. Not a big surprise. Definitely not a big negative. And actually, for once, it really quite accurately reflects my feelings about the market in the now. A flat few months really looks like the only likelihood at the macro level. Even just dividing into north and south, of course, would reveal an anemic market down south and a buoyant one up north, especially at the lower end of the price ranges. This is a long-established pattern in the new world, or the new old world, of interest rates now. There'll always be micro markets that are hot for a variety of reasons. For example, if you're interested or you live in Norfolk and you're not already heavily involved in Sizewell C-related projects, give your heads a wobble. Get over to Leiston. The rest of the survey, new buyer inquiries at -26%, not good, but an improvement on March and April. Sales agreed stuck at -28 from -30. 3-month expectations -5%. And I'm less miserable than the average RICS surveyor. And I also remember that inflation exists. So that's why I'm saying flat market rather than slightly down market. But as an aside, flat markets are fantastic. 2019 was a flat market, and we did fantastically in 2019. Lots of reductions, which I've already talked about, lots and lots. Uncertainty, and anyone who wants an excuse to be inactive will take it. Therefore, fewer buyers, loads of stock, great recipe for portfolio building. Simple economics, folks. Propenomix, right? So the 12-month reading on the RICS survey is back to plus 25%. So that's the expectation. The number of valuers who think prices will be up over the next 12 months, minus the number of valuers who think prices will be flat or downwards, 25% plus. It's a good print, best print since February. So basically what they're saying is they're feeling stamp duty's come and gone, and now the market's just going to get on with business as usual until the next change or tweak or whatever. -8% main print is the weakest since July 2024, which didn't lead to a bloodbath by any means. But when you break that back into regions, what you see is the East and the Southwest printing -34 and -31. And at the other end of the spectrum, Northern Ireland printing +92. So very much encourage everybody to look at their own regional and micro markets, of course. This is just the macro stuff. RICS report talks of tenant demand regaining impetus after a recent slowdown. So +22% is the most positive reading since September 24. -34 was the print for new landlord instructions, so agents are continuing to struggle to generate new stock. +43% expect rent increase in the coming quarter. So the little dry patch that many landlords I've been speaking to may well be over, according to this. Our letting rate has picked up, but not yet to the point where I'd be confident saying the stretch is over. But as in the 21-22 sales market, this is from white hot to red hot to temporarily cooled without a Liz Truss style event ahead of us, we hope. So a better week on the gilts to report on? Well, not really. I mean, we opened at 4.137 yield for the 5-year gilts. On Monday, closed at 4.074, so a small down week. Thursday's close was 3.989, underneath that elusive 4%. The unemployment figures did their bit, and negative growth, missing expectations, almost always leads to decaying yields. Thursday's swap close was 3.663. The discount from the 5-year gilt yield was 32 basis points. Concerns from 2 weeks ago are gone. 1 month ago, the 5-year swap was 3.771% yield. 1 year ago, it was 3.937. Recent historical context, right? So our best guess of the cost of limited company mortgage debt, 5.65 to 5.7. I ignore the arrangement fees in this. I'm talking about the raw cost of the debt. So you may well say, well, I'm actually paying 4.7, but then you've got a 5% product fee to consider. So our safe range of debt costs you about 6% these days on a limited company buy-to-let is a realistic one to work from. Deep dive left us with no choice this week. The week of the spending review, and it sets the tone for the rest of the Parliament with a major impact on confidence or lack of it. and something we are drastically lacking in the UK economy at the moment, in case you haven't noticed. This was the biggest fiscal event until the next budget, which the date has not yet been set for, but late October, early November is the favourite. Halloween, if you will. So what does the document lay out? Well, departmental budgets for day-to-day spending until the 28-29 fiscal year, and 1 year further on than that for capital investment. So I'm going to run this analysis as you'd expect. I'm concentrating on the implications for housing, and then a summary of the rest of the review that will impact jobs, the economy, and ultimately all of our lives in the UK. But let's set the context properly first. What has spending done in real terms over the past 5 years? So basically over the past parliament, right? Moved up by 3.6% a year above inflation. Well, that's what government spending has done. Now, you'll have noticed inflation's been absolutely rife. And at points, of course, big government was definitely needed. But the pandemic's long gone. And whilst a reasonable shadow would include future research and better measures against another pandemic, that sort of level of growth in government spending in real terms just does not match an economy at all that hardly grew above inflation at all over that period and didn't grow per capita. Another way of framing that is that the deal that people got was no more money per head, but more government spend per head. Now, I'd love to say this translated into better services, but I'm pretty sure most people listening wouldn't agree with that. So hopefully someone other than just government employees is benefiting from all of this. 0.8% per year was the GDP growth between 2019 and 2024. So spending went up 4 times as fast as GDP growth. And the OBR forecast is 1.5 a year over this parliament, which is a number we're not currently hitting and a number that a lot of people think is pretty hopeful. I definitely think we're capable of 2% growth or more. Are we under Labour? Depends if they were serious about actually cutting some regulation, as they're doing, as they're making things easier in the development housing market. So give them their credit where it is due, despite some of their plankish communications sometimes, like Keir Starmer telling developers to get on with it, like it's going to make any difference. It's just going to upset people. But there we go. On top of that, though, the moving demographics of a lot of baby boomers getting older, whilst not so many workers come into the population to replace them, whether that's migration or no migration, plus debt interest hurting a lot more than it did in the 2010s. And then there's that thorny issue of working age benefits to discuss as well. So the report and the jargon splits expenditure, and this is important to understand, between day-to-day and capital investment spending, right? So day-to-day real terms increases 1.7% per annum real terms over this parliament. That should be what the people feel in the now if we don't have another crisis. 90% of this, 90%, is going to health / the NHS, excluding devolved departments, so excluding Scotland, Wales, etc. Other departments are therefore getting very little of this day to day, or they're getting real terms cuts, right? At a high level, the Home Office is in there for cuts, political low-hanging fruit, plus a genuinely messy asylum situation left by the last government. They're going to cut 2 billion on asylum spending, we're told, and no more hotels within 12 months, we're told. There's another spending review next year, of course, and this isn't set in stone. Indeed, I've commented many times that when another year rolls around, it's just another year to pretend to steal from or make tough decisions in. When it gets here, that can all just be kicked another 5 years down the road. Okay, where does housing come into the equation here? Well, a ready reckoner is always the number of times a term is measured, is mentioned in the report. Housing gets 53 mentions, defence gets 84, health 65, and the NHS 58. So it's fair to say, whilst it didn't get a lot of headlines in the other major macro reviews, some of that because the big headline was the 39 billion for affordable over 10 years. And that was, of course, broken, as pretty much all of these things were, leaked / news was broken in the lead up to the spending review. So it wasn't a surprise. It's still obviously very much certainly very near the top of the agenda, or well in the Overton window, the political topics of the moment, the things that are allowed to be discussed, if you like, at the moment. Child poverty is also high up on the agenda, of course linked to housing, without doubt. Housing plus free school meals and breakfast clubs are the biggest ingredients there as this government sees it. There's much made of the 10-year affordable homes programme. Last week, the report I analysed suggested there would just about be enough money if all the affordable homes were indeed at affordable rents, aka LHA, and they were delivered by not-for-profit RPs, registered providers, right? Not that they're geared up to deliver 90,000 homes a year, but that's another story. And that would also leave us with 0 social homes, or homes at social rents, to be more accurate. That's just not a reality this government's prepared to face. They also throw the Warm Homes Grant Scheme into the mixer, which will provide insulation, heating and solar for EPCs D to G, households under 36,000, roughly the median income, with up to 30,000 available per house. 15,000 for insulation, glazing, solar and battery, 15,000 more for low carbon heating or heat pumps. So there's 100 million for early interventions to prevent homelessness that appears relatively quickly in the report, alongside 950 million of capital investment to the local authority housing fund to increase supply of temporary accommodation and drive down B&B or hotel costs for TA, temporary. Housing for the Oxcam corridor rears its head again. I don't think outside of rail and infrastructure generally to make this happen, the government will have much of a problem here at all in the private sector, because there'll be developers queuing up because the demographics, the household incomes and the likes will stack up in that neck of the woods with no problem whatsoever. So it's page 31 of the report before we get to a whole section named housing. The report describes a major shortage. They are still utterly stupidly talking about 1.5 million homes, whilst their absolute best case following wind scenario could look to be like perhaps delivering 300,000 homes in one of the years in this parliament or beyond it, and then multiplying that by 5. It's just such poor rhetoric when, whatever happens, the vast majority will be built in the private sector by for-profit house builders who the government have pretty much no control of, especially without using any help to buy style schemes, which they're not at the moment. Then there's a reminder, which is a fair one, that the rewrite of the NPPF, the National Planning Policy Framework, was judged to be worth 0.2% of GDP and boost the economy by 6.8 billion by 2030. That should be all of our styles. Move some words around to add billions to growth and the tax take. What about beyond the much publicised but inherently vastly insufficient for social housing 39 billion pledged? The report also refers to 4.8 billion in financial transactions, or FTs, catalysing additional private investment to further boost house building. What does that actually mean? Well, there's a whole box on it in the report, and the claim is the government is fostering an entrepreneurial state, and FTs allow the government to invest alongside the private sector through equity, loans and guarantees. These fit within the fiscal rules framework, which is why the government likes them. The claim in the report is that this allows the capacity of public financial institutions, think like the National Wealth Fund project and the British Business Bank, to increase by around 40% this parliament to 137 billion, which is by no means a small number. But what needs to happen? Well, a financial return or a clear benefit for taxpayers. There's an annual report too. There are new opportunities identified here for FTs to drive growth, and there's an increase of 9.6 billion over the period, which will be reflected in this autumn's budget, we're told. There's a £1 billion increase to the devolved governments. This total capacity, the 137 billion, is of course a bit smoke and mirrors because it includes guarantees and also recycling of previous financial transactions. But let's talk about the split. The National Wealth Fund is 18 billion of loans and equity and 10 billion of guarantees. The British Business Bank is fairly similar, 17.5 billion loans and equity, 8 billion of guarantees. UK Export Finance, though, is where all the money comes from, with 10 billion of loans and equity and 70 billion of guarantees. And then GB Energy with 4 billion of loans or equity. Now, it's not clear on the split between loan and equity, but of the claimed 137 billion, 49 is actually loans or equity. So 4.8 billion extra, it's clear that housing actually forms a really small part of this, and this really deserves to be more in an export section than a housing section, but there we go. And of course that makes sense because the sector needs repair after Brexit, whichever way the state decides to go with it, if it ever properly makes its mind up. And then the last line in the report on the housing section, the UK is to launch a UK-wide mortgage guarantee scheme in July to ensure the consistent availability of mortgages for buyers with small deposits. This will be badged, I'd imagine, as the solution to the deposit problem, but will it move the needle? Well, rest assured, it will be analysed when it comes out, but it does seem to form part of the plan for the only department that Labour really seem to have a plan for, housing. Pound for pound, they get far less criticism for their housing policy. Of course, the 1.5 million homes is derided, and correctly so, but other than that, really, much less criticism than their other policies from what I've observed anyway. Next mention of housing comes under devolution and regional growth. a new local growth fund for specific mayoral city regions in the North and the Midlands. If they still called it thus, this would be levelling up, of course. This is 2026 territory, and there are no numbers yet. There's a promise to analyse the competitiveness and the complementarities, which is a new word on me, to be honest with you, between housing and transport projects, which is badly needed as an approach, really. But will it happen, and how will it happen? Next up, £500 million or so into the children's social care system, another £500 million to pump into the estate that delivers all of that, supporting refurbishment and expansion. So this is Labour's foray into the private sector that is publicly making a lot of money in this area at the moment, which is currently nowhere near as dramatic as promised. A lot of the increase in the overall budget of the ministry, which is Housing, Communities and Local Government, as it's now named, MHCLG, you might have lost track with a number of name changes over recent years, is actually the financial transactions as named above. Now, I like the idea of the co-investment as a minority shareholder or equity provider of the state. I think the state's got a great role to play in that, especially in the UK, where it's hard to raise equity for things. There should be great opportunities around them. The state has the lowest cost of capital of anybody. I'm just not convinced it's the same as actually spending it, because as a minority, how much control will the government have over all of that? And they'll either need 10 times as much or 1/10 of what they forecast, in my opinion, rather than being able to forecast that accurately. Back to the affordable programme now. Of the 39 billion pledge, there's a reminder and some clarification. It hits 4 billion a year in 2029-30 and then goes up every year with inflation. So it's effectively protecting it for the 10-year period. And they're so pleased with this bit, they say it twice within 6 bullet points. If you're interested in as pedantic as I am, that's pages 81 and 82 of the report. Just shows it hasn't been proofread properly apart from anything else, but it's only a government document, so, there you go. And then there's the 10-year index linking CPI +1. Ideally, you would do that for 25 or 40 or 50 years for social rents. But there we go. There's a consultation coming about social rent convergence. So that's basically existing social rents going upwards. Now, next time you send out a rent increase letter or a Section 13 notice, do you think wording it as a private rental convergence would help the tenant? But yes, government speak, of course. We then get into 2.5 billion of low interest loans for social housing providers over this review period. 1 billion of new investment for remediation of social housing. The soundbite you might have already heard is that social housing providers are getting the same access to government funding just as private building owners do. So plans for new towns and Cambridge, which sounds a bit ominous for the Cantabs, are promised shortly. Government speak for, we haven't really started on those yet, and there's no real deadline yet. That's why there's no deadline. But there's a genuine effort in this report, and I really do welcome it, to add some further transparency and accounting reality to these situations. Having been involved a few years ago in a deal gone wrong, where one of the major blockers was that temporary accommodation is temporary, according to the local authority, when it absolutely isn't, as we know it, with double-digit rises in the sector as recently as 2024. The truth is it should be temporary for the households currently in that sector, although for many of them it isn't, but the problem is permanent. Permanently crystallising areas such as the Household Support Fund, which includes the discretionary housing payments, which many of you will have heard of, into a crisis and resilience fund. Again, yes, it's very government speak, but it's also a pretty good description of what's needed in those situations. So this is badged as the poorest families not having children go hungry outside at term time. There's an ambition, just like ending hotel usage for asylum or B&B usage for temporary accommodation, to end the dependency on food banks. This is one area where I must say I admire the ambition of this government and the courage to speak out about it. I really hope that at least one of these ambitions can be delivered, but I'd accept a 50% in all three cut over this parliament, because that would still be an amazing achievement. It's a nearly impossible task, but stretch goals are a good thing. The remaining entities are around devolved governments, basically rebadging what's already been said with devolved and diluted statistics. Less money, but more money per head. That's how the Barnett formula works, if you've never seen it before. Nothing devolution specific, though, that deserves any more attention, I don't think. But there's one more chart and the impact of this chart from here that I thought I would share. The old picture's worth 1,000 words. This is what I shared this week. The impact to all households by decile over the next 5 years of the 2024 budget. So this is Labour's mission statement through and through. And while I deride forecasts on a weekly basis, you can see why they implemented it. This is the levelling up they want to achieve. Turn it on its head. You can see why that top 10% of households, who by definition are most likely the most mobile, because they've got the most money apart from anything else. About 1 in 3 were born outside of the UK, because foreign born households are overrepresented in the highest income decile, I'd argue it's much easier to leave. And it feels much more natural to leave if you weren't born in the UK. So the analysis is great as long as it doesn't lead to disproportionate numbers of the top 10% who pay that big old slice of the tax, 60% of the income tax, as I said earlier, leaving because things have got worse for them over 5 years. It's just not much of a deal, is it? And whilst, again, it brings to life the Labour proposition, it might just also be the best representation of why we do end up losing a lot of high-income households over the coming years. So what's the conclusion then? Well thought out, transparent, ideological, looking after the lowest 10, 20, 50%, all of the above. Realistic? Well, it's as realistic as any forecast. I do like the honesty. Can we create big, great stuff at a country level using financial engineering? Maybe. Let's see how these financial transactions actually play out. We know there's not enough money for social rent homes, but then rent convergence has yet to be fully laid out. The sooner they adopt the community rent model from Darren Rodwell, which I've talked about before, or an equivalent flex rent model that Granger tend to talk about, the sooner that happens, the better. Interesting, the cap proposed in such a model is 40% of income, but we're told everything above 30%, according to the ONS, is not affordable. So that's one for another day, isn't it, really? But it just shows that the arbitrary usage of a number, often 50% is used in London, as many will know. But there we go. What about the rest of it then, the wrap up? Well, defence is coming upwards in percentage terms. We knew that. The NHS swallows nearly everything. We kind of knew that as well. The report was criticised as being hard to understand, which I hear, but I dare say that there's actually been an attempt here to communicate with those that understood what was being communicated about. And yes, there's a sprinkling of ideology. And yes, there's the occasional passive-aggressive reference to the terrible inheritance, although it's impossible not to remember that. And so it very much wasn't for clicks. This is actually a report with a purpose, and it had a go at delivering it. The IFS director, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Paul Johnson, made the point that it's all about how it is spent rather than the forecasts, but the decisions were and are incredibly tough. Well, as Paul knows, that's economics, right? But he closes his analysis by pointing out we'll be watching the performance versus the forecast in the autumn from the OBR, and we absolutely will. In fact, I'll be watching the OBR output here monthly. That's the outturn versus the forecast. How much did we borrow versus how much did the OBR forecast we were borrowing? Forget everybody else because they really don't matter. What matters is the OBR because that's what sets the tone for the budget. And that's why I'll be looking at that monthly, including in the following week's supplement because it's time for that report. So we're not looking at more tax rises today as I see it in October or November. What I'd be doing if I was Rachel Reeves is I'd be trying to look at how we can stop people saving so much and start them spending it because we badly need to make that happen. So in other words, take away incentives for saving because people are saving too much as it is. Drop the ISA cash limit and then push them towards equity investments or not saving that money and spending it instead. I think that's by far the best way. But what will happen in July when tariff gate kicks back in? What happens if oil goes over $100 a barrel? It's the same as usual. The risks are to the upside in terms of yields, unless the mess gets recessionary and then rates will be cut. We're not heading for that in a realistic scenario I can see at the moment, but we are in for a bumpy ride, so stay tuned. Now, as we've come to the end once more, remember to book your tickets for Thursday, 3rd of July, next property business workshop, joint ventures and mergers and acquisitions. Another great day of learning and discussion is guaranteed. Now, remember those early bird tickets have only got a week or so left, so book quickly at bit.ly/PBWSEVEN. Link is in the show notes. And above all, please remember to keep calm. Always listen to the supplement and carry on. There will be opportunities abound this year and towards 2030. The risks around at this time, whilst they feel significant, the geopolitical ones, are far less meaningful to the UK housing market than they have been for several years. Of that, I have no doubt. Good luck.